We bought salmon from 12 of the biggest grocery chains in America, checked what's actually behind each label, and most of them did not hold up. One chain spent 3 years in federal court defending the word sustainable on its own salmon packaging, twice lost the motion to make the case go away, and eventually agreed to take the word off entirely. Another chain's private label, smoked salmon, was recalled for listeria contamination just last year. Only a small handful of the 12 stores we checked are actually backing up what's printed on the package with real, verifiable sourcing, and the ranking probably isn't the one you'd expect walking in. The salmon aisle isn't what it looks like. Salmon feels like the safest choice in the entire seafood case. It's pink, it's healthy, it's the fish doctors actually recommend, and it's usually sitting right at eye level specifically because grocery chains know how reliably it sells. But the words on that label, wild, sustainable, responsibly sourced, mean wildly different things depending entirely on which store you're standing in. And in a few cases, those exact words have already been challenged in actual federal court by actual plaintiffs, with actual rulings attached. We pulled the sourcing policies, the certifications, the court records, and the documented recall history behind 12 major American grocery chains, from the biggest wholesale clubs down to the regional favorites, and ranked them from most concerning to genuinely trustworthy. Every claim in this video comes from an actual company policy, a court filing, or a federal recall notice, not a guess, not an assumption, and not a single anonymous online review. Grab whatever's in your own freezer right now because there's a decent chance it shows up somewhere on this list. Let's get into it. What color added actually means. Before we start, one label you're going to see on almost every single piece of farmed salmon in this video. Color added. Wild salmon get their signature pink color naturally from a lifetime of eating krill and shrimp rich in a pigment called astaxanthin. Farmed salmon, raised in pens on formulated feed pellets instead of a natural diet, don't have access to that same pigment source. So astaxanthin is added directly into the feed instead, and the FDA legally requires that fact to be disclosed on the package, right down to specific federal code sections governing exactly how it has to be worded. This is not, on its own, a food safety issue. Astaxanthin has been approved for use in salmon feed since the 1970s. It's chemically identical whether it comes from a natural algae source or a synthetic one, and food safety regulators on both sides of the Atlantic consider it safe at the levels actually used in commercial feed. Without it, farmed salmon flesh comes out a dull gray, which is exactly why the additive exists in the first place, to replicate a color wild salmon get for free from their diet. Here's the actual gap worth knowing. What the label does not have to tell you is whether that astaxanthin came from a natural source, like algae or yeast, or a synthetic one made from petrochemicals, since both trigger the exact same 3 words on the package. If you see color added and want to know which kind you're actually getting, that's a question worth asking the seafood counter directly or checking the specific brand's own published sourcing page, because the label sitting in front of you genuinely won't answer it either way. One more piece of context worth knowing before we get into specific stores. Salmon mislabeling as a category has been studied directly, and the results are actually a bit more reassuring than you'd expect walking in. Oceana, the ocean conservation group, ran DNA testing on salmon samples collected from restaurants and grocery stores across several major American cities and found mislabeling rates as high as 43% during winter months when wild salmon isn't actually in season and something has to fill the gap. The overwhelming majority of that mislabeling, though, happened at restaurants and sushi counters, not at grocery store seafood cases. Large grocery chains, which are legally required to disclose species, country of origin, and wild or farmed status right on the package, actually came out as the most consistently trustworthy vendors in Oceana's own research, with mislabeling rates closer to 7 to 18% depending on the season. A real number, but nowhere near the level found in restaurants. That's genuinely useful context heading into this list. The the 12 chains below aren't generally lying about what species is in the package. Where they differ is in how that fish was actually raised and how much of that story they're willing to put in writing. Aldi's Fresh Atlantic Salmon carries a Best Aquaculture Practices certification, and for years the packaging read, "In cheerful lowercase confidence, simple, sustainable, seafood." 2 separate class action lawsuits challenged that exact phrase. One, filed by a shopper named Jessica Rawson, argued the salmon was partly sourced from Chilean net pen farms that the Monterey Bay Aquarium's own Seafood Watch program specifically recommends avoiding, citing concerns about pollutants, disease, and escaped fish spreading from open net pens directly into the surrounding ocean. A federal judge in Illinois rejected Aldi's request to dismiss the case twice, ruling that a certification logo sitting on the package doesn't automatically make the word sustainable accurate to an ordinary, reasonable shopper reading it at the shelf. A second lawsuit, filed separately by the nonprofit Toxin Free USA, made a nearly identical argument that the phrase led consumers to believe Aldi's salmon was farmed under high environmental and animal welfare standards when the underlying sourcing told a very different story. Both cases were resolved through mediation in 2024, years after the original filings. As part of that resolution, Aldi denied any wrongdoing, as companies settling this kind of case almost always do, but agreed to remove the word sustainable from its Fresh Atlantic Salmon packaging entirely going forward. Worth sitting with for a second, the BAP certification itself is still there on the package today, unchanged. The specific word a federal court twice found plausible grounds for a deceptive marketing claim is the one thing that actually had to go. It's also worth being fair to Aldi here in one specific way. BAP certification is a real, legitimate program, not a made-up seal, and Chile's net pen, aquaculture industry as a whole has made real documented improvements over the past decade in areas like disease management and escape prevention. The lawsuits weren't arguing that Aldi's salmon was unsafe to eat. They were arguing specifically that the word sustainable, sitting right there on the front of the bag, promised something more absolute than what a single industry certification can actually guarantee. And 2 separate federal courts, looking at 2 separate complaints, both agreed that argument deserved to actually go to trial rather than get dismissed on the spot. Walmart's official seafood policy sets a goal of sourcing all of its farmed and wild-caught seafood from fisheries certified under the Global Sustainable Seafood Initiative, with a target date of 2025, the same broad certification umbrella that several other chains on this list also reference. That's a real published commitment, and GSSI recognized certification is a legitimate, meaningful standard when it's genuinely in place across a supply chain. What the policy does not spell out in any specific public detail is an antibiotic use policy for its everyday farmed salmon, the way Sam's Club or Trader Joe's each explicitly do for their own private label lines. Several independent seafood buying guides have flagged this exact gap directly, recommending shoppers default to a clearly labeled antibiotic-free or wild-caught option, specifically when shopping at Walmart, rather than assuming the standard fresh salmon fillet automatically meets that bar just because a nearby sign mentions sustainability in general terms. None of this means Walmart salmon is unsafe to eat. GSSI certified sourcing, where it's actually documented and verified, is a real standard, not an empty phrase. It just means the transparency gap here is genuinely bigger than at several other chains on this exact list, and a shopper actually trying to compare antibiotic policies store to store will find noticeably less specific public information published by Walmart than by its direct competitors sitting one aisle over in a different store. To Walmart's credit, the company is by far the largest grocery seller in the country, and a public commitment covering that much volume, even one still working toward a deadline, is a meaningfully bigger lift to actually implement than the same pledge from a chain a fraction of its size. That scale is exactly why the gap matters here specifically, though, since the sheer volume involved means Walmart's specific salmon sourcing choices affect more American dinner tables on any given night than almost anyone else's on this entire list. Safeway and Albertsons. Safeway, Vons, and the rest of the Albertsons family of stores publish general sustainability language around seafood sourcing, but noticeably less specific publicly available detail about salmon standards specifically than chains like Kroger or Whole Foods, which each publish detailed year-over-year certification percentages broken down by species. Albertson's private label seafood and prepared foods have also been swept into broader chain-wide recalls in recent years, tied to shared supplier facilities. The exact same pattern that shows up repeatedly across this entire list once you actually start checking which specific company packs a given product behind the scenes. That shared supplier pattern is worth sitting with for a second, because it applies well beyond just Albertsons. A recall or a sourcing gap rarely stays contained to one single store brand, since a huge amount of the seafood case across very different looking grocery chains is quietly processed by the same small handful of suppliers before any of it ever reaches a specific store's own private label packaging. Two completely different looking bags on two completely different shelves can trace back to the exact same processing floor. That's not necessarily a knock on either specific chain. Plenty of shared supplier arrangements run cleanly for years without incident. It's just a reason to treat our store as a much smaller guarantee of anything than the branding on the bag would like you to believe. BJ's Wholesale Club. In February of 2026, BJ's issued a recall of its Wellesley Farms brand farm-raised Atlantic salmon, 2-pound bags sold across 7 states, including Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, due to possible Listeria monocytogenes contamination identified through routine testing. No illnesses were reported at the time of the recall, and BJ's pulled the specific lot and notified members directly once the risk was identified, which is the correct responsible response once a batch tests positive for a pathogen like this one. Listeria is a genuine concern specifically for pregnant women, older adults, and anyone with a weakened immune system, since it can cause serious, sometimes fatal illness in those groups, even from small amounts of contaminated product, while causing only mild symptoms or none at all in a healthy adult. This isn't a reason to specifically avoid BJ's going forward. Recalls happen across nearly every single chain on this list and are, in a strange way, a sign that the safety testing system is actually working, catching contamination before it reaches wider distribution rather than after. It is a reason to always check your own freezer against any lot number listed in an active recall notice, since the product itself, sitting right there in the bag, almost always looks, smells, and tastes completely normal. The FDA and USDA both maintain free, searchable public recall databases specifically for exactly this reason, and a habit of checking them every few months takes less time than reading this paragraph did. Publix doesn't publish the same level of detailed quantified seafood sourcing data that Kroger, Sam's Club, or Whole Foods each make public year over year, which genuinely makes it harder to independently verify specific claims about its fresh salmon program from the outside, rather than simply taking the in-store signage at face value. Independent seafood buying guides have generally placed Publix in an acceptable middle tier, neither flagged for a specific documented controversy the way Aldi has been, nor backed by the kind of detailed third-party certification data that the top of this list actually puts in writing. In practice, that means Publix shoppers are left leaning more heavily on in-store labeling and the seafood counter staff's own product knowledge than on a published, independently checkable company standard, which isn't automatically a red flag. Plenty of regional chains operate this way without incident, but it is a real, measurable gap compared to the handful of chains that put their actual sourcing numbers in writing every single year for anyone to go check. That gap doesn't mean the fish behind the counter is worse. It just means a shopper trying to verify the claim independently, rather than simply trust it. Has a lot less to actually go on at Publix than at several other stores in this exact comparison. Costco Kirkland Signature's fresh farmed Atlantic salmon is sourced primarily from Norway, with some frozen and smoked product sourced from Chile as well, and Costco's own published sourcing page confirms only some of its farmed salmon suppliers currently carry full Aquaculture Stewardship Council certification, rather than all of them across the board. Costco's Kirkland Signature smoked salmon specifically, farm-raised in Norway and finished in the Netherlands before reaching American warehouses, was recalled by its manufacturer, Acme Smoked Fish Corporation, in 2024, after testing found Listeria monocytogenes present in more than 100 cases of product already on shelves. On the positive side of the ledger, Costco's Wild Alaskan Salmon line is supplied directly by Trident Seafoods, which maintains full ownership and control of that specific supply chain, operating under Alaska's constitutionally protected sustainable fisheries management system, genuinely one of the more rigorous wild fishery standards anywhere in the world, written directly into the state's own constitution rather than left to a voluntary industry certification. That's a real split worth actually knowing before your next warehouse run. Costco's Wild Alaskan line stands on some of the strongest sourcing standards on this entire list, while its everyday fresh farmed salmon, the one most shoppers actually grab because it's sitting right at the front of the case, sits on a less fully certified, considerably more mixed supply chain just a few feet away. Costco members looking for the stronger of the two options don't actually need to do much detective work to find it. The Wild Alaskan products carry Trident's name and Alaska's own sourcing language directly on the package, while the fresh farmed filet simply says Norway, or less often Chile, without much else. Same warehouse, same membership card, two genuinely different supply chains sitting a single refrigerated case apart from each other. Target's history with farmed salmon is genuinely unusual among this entire group of 12. The company announced years ago that it was pulling farmed salmon entirely from its fresh, frozen, and smoked seafood sections chain-wide, switching its private label lines over to wild-caught Alaskan salmon instead, citing environmental concerns tied specifically to farm pollution and the risk of farmed fish escaping into wild populations. That's a real chain-wide policy shift, not a vague marketing slogan sitting on a bag, and it moved actual private label product off actual physical shelves in actual stores nationwide. Whether that specific policy has held in exactly the same form in every single store today is worth double-checking at your own local Target, since seafood sourcing policies do genuinely shift over time across this entire industry as suppliers, prices, and demand all change year to year. But the underlying move itself, a major national retailer voluntarily walking away from an entire category of farmed product specifically over sourcing concerns, remains one of the more concrete, verifiable actions on this whole list, rather than just a certification logo quietly printed on a bag. It's the kind of decision that costs a retailer real shelf space and real supplier relationships to make, which is generally a stronger signal than a policy that only ever shows up as a paragraph on a corporate sustainability page nobody actually reads. Sam's Club members Mark Farm raised Atlantic salmon at Sam's Club, carries both Best Aquaculture Practices 4-star and Aquaculture Stewardship Council certification simultaneously, and the company explicitly states its farmed salmon is raised without antibiotics, printed directly on the package rather than buried in a separate corporate sustainability report. Sam's Club has also set a public goal of sourcing all members' mark seafood, wild and farmed alike, from GSSI-recognized certification programs by 2025, alongside a completely separate wild-caught Alaskan sockeye line sold specifically under that clearer, unambiguous wild label rather than blended in with the farmed options. The certification stack here is genuinely one of the more complete ones on this entire list. 4-star BAP paired with ASC together cover feed sourcing, environmental impact, and antibiotic use in a way that a single certification alone often doesn't manage on its own. The gap if there is one worth naming, is the same gap that shows up across nearly every large retailer in this video, a published goal with a deadline still a bit further out rather than a company simply claiming full completion today. Right now, on every single product, Sam's Club at least separates its wild and farmed lines clearly enough on the shelf that a shopper isn't left guessing which specific standard applies to which specific bag. Kroger has run a formal seafood sustainability partnership with the World Wildlife Fund since 2009, and its published sourcing reports are some of the most detailed and specific of any chain in this entire video. As of its most recent public reporting, Kroger stated that 99% of the farm-raised seafood moving through its seafood department met its own sustainability sourcing requirements alongside continued funded work through dozens of separate fishery improvement projects specifically aimed at moving more wild-caught seafood toward full Marine Stewardship Council certification over time, rather than settling for a static number and stopping there. That level of specific year-over-year published data is genuinely rare in this entire industry, and it's a big part of why Kroger tends to rank consistently well in independent seafood sourcing comparisons conducted by outside researchers, rather than by the company itself. Publishing a specific number you might actually fall short of next year is a fundamentally different kind of accountability than publishing a nice-sounding slogan you can quietly walk back later without anyone noticing, and Kroger has consistently publicly chosen the harder, more accountable option. That consistency across more than a decade of partnership with an outside conservation group, rather than a single press release timed around a launch, is exactly the kind of long track record that's genuinely hard to fake. Sprouts Farmers Market. Sprouts Farmers Market requires third-party certification and full chain of custody documentation from every seafood supplier, explicitly ruling out fisheries and farms that can't actually produce that paperwork on request, backed by a formal written policy document covering exactly which certifications qualify and how non-certified sources can still be considered on a case-by-case basis, but only if they're actively enrolled in a credible, independently monitored improvement plan with defined goals and a real management body overseeing it. That's a considerably more procedurally detailed public policy than several much larger, better-known chains on this entire list have bothered to publish. Sprouts markets itself around a fresher, more curated selection generally, leaning into a wellness-oriented brand identity, and its actual seafood sourcing policy backs that specific positioning up with real documentation requirements rather than just a general feel-good vibe painted across the store. That's a distinction worth genuinely noticing, given how many other wellness-branded grocers people assume are automatically better turned out. Once you actually go looking, to have noticeably thinner paperwork sitting behind the marketing than Sprouts does. A store built around the feeling of freshness and a store built around documented, verifiable sourcing aren't always the same store, and Sprouts is a rare case where the two actually line up. Trader Joe's farm-raised salmon is sold specifically labeled as raised without antibiotics, and the chain has built a broader reputation for tightly controlled, relatively simple private label sourcing across its entire seafood case, generally avoiding the more opaque, frequently rotating supplier arrangements that show up at some larger, more sprawling chains on this list. Trader Joe's doesn't publish the same detailed quantified sustainability reporting that Kroger or Whole Foods each make public every single year, which genuinely makes some of its broader claims harder to independently verify from the outside compared to those two. What Trader Joe's does have going for it, specifically on this topic, is a genuinely clean track record. No salmon-specific lawsuit, no salmon-specific recall showing up anywhere in the reporting behind this video, and a consistent, specific antibiotic-free claim printed directly on the actual product itself, rather than a vague, chain-wide slogan sitting several steps removed from the specific fish sitting in your actual cart. For a chain that famously doesn't do much traditional advertising in the first place, letting the product label itself carry the specific claim rather than a bigger corporate campaign fits the brand's whole general approach, Whole Foods Market. And this is the one that actually sets the bar for the rest of this entire list. Whole Foods developed its quality standards for aquaculture, together with outside scientists and environmental groups from the very beginning. And every single farm supplying its responsibly farmed salmon is independently audited on an annual basis against those standards, not just certified once at the start of the relationship and quietly left alone for years afterward. The standards themselves ban antibiotics, added growth hormones, and poultry or mammalian byproducts in feed entirely, require full traceability back to the specific individual farm a given fillet actually swam at, and explicitly prohibit treating fish pens with toxic anti-fouling chemicals used to control algae growth, a practice that remains completely legal and is still actively used at plenty of farms supplying several other chains on this exact list. Whole Foods sources its farmed salmon from a small, specifically named group of partners in Norway, Scotland, and Iceland, including a family-owned Norwegian farm called Coveroy Fiskeoppdrett, that Whole Foods features by name in its own marketing, specifically because the relationship between retailer and farm is close and well documented enough to actually do so without hedging. Of the 12 chains covered in this entire video, Whole Foods is the only one whose seafood standards were built with named third-party scientists and environmentalists in the room from the very start, verified through annual third-party audits rather than a one-time certification, and specific enough to rule out an entire category of chemical treatment that other suppliers on this list still legally use every day. It also, unsurprisingly, tends to be the most expensive salmon of any chain in this entire comparison, and that price gap is, honestly, the most straightforward explanation for why the underlying standards look the way they do. There's a real honest trade-off worth naming plainly here, and it's the same one that shows up across almost every category on almost every one of these grocery comparison videos. Annual third-party audits named family-owned farms and a complete ban on an entire category of chemical net treatment all cost real money to maintain, and that cost shows up directly on the price tag rather than getting quietly absorbed somewhere else in the supply chain. Whether that premium is worth it to you personally depends on your own budget and your own priorities, but at least at Whole Foods, you can actually trace exactly what that extra cost on the receipt is paying for, which puts it in a different category entirely from paying more simply because a bag looks more expensive. The actual verdict. So here's where 12 major chains actually land, side by side. Aldi settled 2 separate federal lawsuits over the single word sustainable, printed on its own salmon packaging. Walmart's antibiotic policy for its everyday farmed salmon isn't public in any real checkable detail, and independent guides have flagged that gap directly. Several chains on this list, including Costco and BJ's specifically, have had real documented listeria recalls tied to salmon products in just the last 2 years. A genuine reminder that this entire category carries real handling risk regardless of price point, brand reputation, or how healthy the fish is supposed to be for you. And a genuine handful, Kroger, Sam's Club, Sprouts, Trader Joe's, and especially Whole Foods, have built sourcing standards specific and public enough that a shopper doesn't have to simply take the label's word for it on faith. None of this means never buy salmon from the chains sitting lower on this list, not even Aldi, not even Walmart, since neither one is on this list for a reason that should make you throw out dinner tonight. Recalls get caught precisely because testing systems are working as intended, certifications genuinely get earned and improved over time, and plenty of fish sold at every single store in this video is completely fine to eat tonight. What it means is that the specific word sitting on the label in front of you, sustainable, responsibly sourced, wild, color added, is only ever as trustworthy as the actual paperwork sitting behind it. And this video just showed you exactly how differently that paperwork reads from one grocery chain to the next, even when the packaging in front of you looks nearly identical. Next time you're standing at the seafood counter deciding between two nearly identical looking fillets, ask one simple question before anything else, out loud if the person behind the counter is actually there to answer it. Not what does the label say? Who actually checked?